And we are back on the Zero Hour. I am, as always, your host, Richard RJ Eskow. I always look forward to my conversations with my next guest. You know him well. Richard Wolff is an economist. He is a historian. He is professor emeritus at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. He is also a professor at the New School University in New York City. He's the host of Economic Update on Free Speech TV. See, I know all this by heart by now. Tuesday evenings on Free Speech TV. I'm sure I'm leaving several things out. His latest book is The Sickness is the System, which I strongly recommend. And without any further ado, Richard Wolff, welcome back to the program.
Thank you, RJ. Glad to be here.
Well, it's always good to have you. And this time I was looking forward to it because I'm going to step out of our customary roles a bit. I know that you are not the psychotherapist in your family, but I feel like I need to get something off my chest, and any response you might have to it, except how does that make you feel, is acceptable. And it's this. I've been watching, like somebody at a tennis game with my head going back and forth, this debate about vaccine patents. These vaccines were developed, ours, primarily at government expense, using publicly available knowledge by scientists who are educated by the public education system by and large. And yet there's this whole discussion about whether we should release the knowledge embedded in these vaccines to the world so that we can potentially save millions of lives, certainly hundreds of thousands, potentially protect our own lives in society from new variants that might override the vaccinations or whatever. And I'm watching all of this. I wrote a piece about it, and it came out kind of a little hippie-ish. I'm kind of reevaluating it, but it's basically like, to paraphrase supposedly something FDR said, what the hell? It's all our knowledge anyway, isn't it? So am I losing my mind, or is this an extremely distorted way of treating information and knowledge?
No, I think I'm happy to be able to report to you that your mental faculties are all in order. You got nothing to worry about there. What you're having is one of those moments when the normal ideological fog we live in becomes so absurd that we see it. For a moment, we see through it. We begin to realize, oh my goodness, there's a fog. So let me explain. Long ago, capitalists developed an anxiety. And the anxiety was justified that any business they had going, no matter how successful it was in fact very vulnerable. All kinds of things could happen to destroy your business and therefore to destroy your position as a capitalist employer at the top of that business. A crucial input would become unavailable. Workers would strike and stop working for you. A competitor would come up with a better or cheaper or both product, or people's tastes would change, and whatever it is you were producing would go out of fashion. I mean, I could go on. All of the risks of business come in and frighten, terrify your average capitalist because of that's the way the system works. So what capitalists did, perfectly understandable, was to look for ways to mitigate, to reduce, to eliminate at least some of the dangerous lurking threats. One of those was competition. The fact that precisely because knowledge is widely dispersed, what goes on in one chemistry lab is not all that different from what goes on in the next chemistry lab. And people are using the available knowledge, extending it, but they're all using the same basic material, which we all know what it is, because that's what we teach young people in the classroom. We teach them the accumulated knowledge, which they will hopefully then take another step. So the danger was that whatever the product produced by any capitalist, it was only a matter of time, and probably not much of it, before the same discovery you got your hands on would be not only equaled, but developed even further by the next person. So how do you protect against that? You create an artificial law, and that artificial law is patent, copyright, trademark, whatever you want to call it. It's basically a way to say to the world, I was the one who made this latest step in the knowledge process, and I can deny the rest of the universe access to what I figured out for a certain number of years. All of these things have a certain number of years, 7 years, a 14-year, a variety of arrangements, and they vary across the disciplines, and they vary from country to country. And then there are some internationally agreed ones. But basically it says, you capitalist, we're going to protect you, your profit, for at least this number of years, because we're going to give you the right to say to any actual or potential competitor, you can't have this piece of knowledge. In other words, you can deny to others what was not denied to you, because the only way you made that breakthrough was because you had access to all the knowledge that led up to the breakthrough you made. Had those people had the patent like you wouldn't have been able to do it. But nobody cares to understand the absurd logic here. So capitalists were able, as they often are, to get the politicians they control with their money, to give them in return to the donation for your campaign, the patent law that exists that creates these things. It means, in the case of medicine, it means that the developer of a medicine, like the vaccine for COVID-19, has the right to withhold knowledge of how to produce that vaccine, whatever the latest technique is that gets you that vaccine, for a certain number of years, and to say to any potential competitor, either you cannot have it, drop dead, go away, or you can have it, but you have to pay me X millions or billions of dollars. In other words, I get a share of whatever profits you can earn because I control this. And if you don't agree to give me that money, well, then you can't have it. The end result is a reality already. It's not a prospective reality. It's an actuality. The New York Times on the 4th, I believe, of May of this year, reports that for rich countries, 1 in 4 persons have now been vaccinated against COVID-19. But in poor countries, the proportion is 1 in 500.
Wow.
Okay, this is no morality, no ethics, no religion I'm aware of would countenance, would endorse, would support, would tolerate such a grotesque injustice and immorality. It means that people who are rich or live in rich countries will have their lives saved on a scale that people whose only crime is that either they are poor or they live in a society that's poor do not have. And it explains why in the United States, all kinds of chartered planes have been landing in the last 3 months at airports across the United States, carrying wealthy people from poor countries so they can come up here, spend a day, get vaccinated, turn around, get back on their private plane, and go home to where they came from. I mean, the grotesquerie here is, it's a testimony to the immorality of the capitalist system if ever you wanted it. Last point. We're being held hostage here. That you have to we're being held hostage to private capitalists' profits. Because if Pfizer, just to pick one, if Pfizer, who earned, by the way, $3.5 billion, this is their own statement, in the first quarter of this year, January, February, March, Pfizer earned $3.5 billion from its vaccines. We are being held hostage, the world is, to the private profits of the Pfizer Corporation. And if it means that all kinds of people can't get their vaccine and die, and all kinds of people can't get their vaccine and get horribly sick with who knows what long-term consequences, that's the price a capitalist world pays to secure the profits of Mr. and Mrs. Pfizer. I mean, of course, they're
Right,
shareholders. One last thing, Rich.
Sure.
The only argument ever given actually bases itself on this blackmail. The argument goes, if you didn't give them the patent protection, they wouldn't do the work. In other words, life-saving medical research wouldn't happen in our society unless the researchers were bribed at the cost of millions of lives. I don't believe those people are that way. That would be a statement of a level of evil I cannot attribute to them. Here's my guess, and I've been a professor all my life. I've striven, like my colleagues have, to be a good teacher, to do research, to publish our work. No one is ever going to give us that kind of money. We're not going to get anything. Even if you get a Nobel Prize, it's $1 million, not $3.5 billion. I'm sure we can get all the quality research in medicine we need. Give those who make a breakthrough a plaque. Give them $1 million. Give them a reward. But there is no need whatsoever. And the notion that we could not get the medical improvement we have without capitalism is a naked ideological ploy to justify profiteering and shouldn't be taken seriously by anyone with half a brain.
Richard Wolff, my only pushback to everything you've said is that my understanding is that it's even worse, in that they don't even do the research. That, in fact, if we're talking specifically about the vaccines, but also true of many patented medications, my understanding is that 2 of the 3 major vaccines were fully developed at public expense, and that the third, which was arguably done privately, well, when you start thinking about the RNA research and all the fundamental discoveries that went into it, maybe 2% of the final product was proprietary. So I guess my question is, isn't it, to me, and I wrote a piece for The Nation about the Zika vaccine, it was the same story. The military actually paid the French corporation Sanofi to develop a Zika vaccine, and then they can charge whatever they want if a Zika outbreak happens. That, to me, is a psychosis. It's not just letting capitalism run wild. It's taking everything you own, putting it in capitalism's hands, and saying, here, charge me whatever you want. And if I'm dying, if my family is dying, and you say, too bad, it's going to cost you to stay alive, fine. To me, that's an ideology going insane.
Yes, it seems to me that's what it is, too. I could only add 2 thoughts. Pfizer had a partner, a German biochemical company. That company got $500 million subsidy from the German government. No one knows except those 2 companies, and they won't tell us, what the shared contribution of the subsidized German company was relative to the unsubsidized Pfizer. They're all making money, but in fact, public money was supportive even of that specific program to produce that specific vaccine. Here's a metaphor I think can capture it. Suppose there's a flood in your community, and what you need to cope with the flood, to prevent it from really doing horrible damage, is to pile sandbags along the edge of the river that's flooding. And so you set up a line of people from the place where the trucks can drop the sandbags to the edge of the river, and a long line of activist villagers stand next to each other, each one handing a bag of sand to the next one so it can go from where the truck dropped them to the river edge where it can stop the flood. And it's successful, and the flood is stopped. And a grateful community gives $1 million to the person at the end of the line on the grounds, this guy, look, he put the sandbag there. Yes, you crazy idiot. That person was there, but that person didn't do anything more than all of the other people who aren't getting a nickel and knew they wouldn't get a nickel because of this crazy system, but they were there because they don't want a flood in the community, because they care about everybody's house. It included people who lived far away and weren't in anywhere near as much danger as the ones who lived closer to the river, and on and on and on and on and on. But in our crazy system, what are they? Not there? What kind of a society would work like that? What kind of an individual at the end of the line would demand and accept the rewards denied to all the others? It is lunacy as well as immoral. And for me, it is the sign of a system so badly dysfunctional that it would not only allow it, but guarantee it.
And
it is pure self-promotional capitalism.
And the person who would accept the $1 million in your example would also be willing to let the town flood if they didn't give it to him. In effect, he's saying, you know what? I don't care how 99 people got us to this point. I'm the guy who makes the difference. You either give me what I want. But the thing is, we as a society act like that's normal. And we as a society celebrate it when our government, when our government says, all right, we'll give the guy the $1 million. We think, oh, that's wonderful. We live in such a benevolent society. We never stop to think about the madness of it all.
Right. And you know, the irony is we could. If all the other people on that line with the sandbags had that mentality, they wouldn't show up because they're not going to get this prize. And if they didn't show up, the one at the end would have no sandbags to pile and wouldn't get the prize either. That is, in the end, the irrationality here is stupefying. You're making believe that the incentive for the millionaire who gets the prize doesn't go hand in hand with the disincentive for everybody else who has the feeling, I'm not going to get the $1 million. Why should I do anything at all? You pay a bitter price for your immorality.
Yeah, including potentially the loss of your talent. And
right.
I guess this is as good a point as any to pivot to what may be a related issue, which is, you know, since we're talking about the 100 people loading the sandbags, which is, at least, you know, in that metaphor, there are 100 people in a line passing sandbags. You can see the labor force and the task at hand. It's right there. But what we're seeing now in the newspapers, you know, headline in the Wall Street Journal, very typical, saying worker shortage plus millions out of work. What's going on? It's as if our paradigm or our model of viewing the economy is broken because we have places claiming they don't have the workers they need. I mean, we could talk about that, but we have people out of jobs. And what does that tell us about the sort of cognitive dysfunction taking place?
Well, I love it because the reason I love this story, and I'm so glad you asked, is because in economics classes of the sort taken by college-educated people, and I presume that's who runs the Wall Street Journal, if you reasoned the way they do, you would get a failing grade in any economics course. And here's the reason. If there's a supply of something, in this case, labor, and if there's a demand for something, in this case, labor, then the way that the theory works is if the demand is greater than the supply, the price goes up. In other words, you can't stop the conversation by saying, gee, there's a shortage, because the teacher then explains to the students, and I've done it 1,000 times. No, no, no. The very word shortage is only meaningful in relationship to what is the price you're offered as an employer. If you offer a higher wage, there won't be a shortage, you idiot. In other words, stop what you're doing.
Right.
This is special pleading. What the employers of America want is they want the shortage to be overcome without raising the wage. They're upset because at the wages they're offering, let's say $10 an hour for your fast food hamburger flipper, that people aren't coming forward at $10 an hour. There's a shortage. What they mean is there's a shortage of people available for $10 an hour, to which the economics instructor tells the student, yes, but if you raise it to $15 an hour, whoosh, the shortage will vanish, because a shortage can't be described separately from what it's a shortage of, what are the circumstances. And the employers of America don't want to pay higher wages. We've seen that in the resistance to the fight for 15 and everything else we've been talking about for years. All you're seeing now is another way to press for cheap labor. Only this time, instead of saying, well, we can't pay that, we'll go out of business, instead, we're being told a shortage of labor, as if there's some mystery here or some special situation. No, there isn't. What has happened is during the pandemic, as people had to make do with less, had to find special ways of getting a little bit of extra money, the $10 an hour fast food, a dishwashing gig in the restaurant has lost its appeal, and for damn good reasons. More important issues in life became important. So you want these people to come back, you've got to give them an incentive. And the employers don't want to do that. They want everything to be as it once was. And they want the people to work cheaply, and they're not available at that price. And they don't want to do what the textbook tells them to do. Oh, you want to have more supply of labor? Then raise the price. That's how you get it. They know that. They took the courses, they got A's, but their employer situation suddenly makes them ignorant of what they just knew. And one should shake one's head in disbelief as how your employer status could make you so forgetful about what you once learned.
Well, what's that statement about you can't teach someone something that it's in their financial interest to not learn?
That's right.
And of course, it seems to me, Richard Wolff, they're also pleading against, sometimes overtly, sometimes covertly, unemployment insurance and the social safety net. They want to say, forgetting, by the way, that the whole purpose of the extra, meager, I would say, extra unemployment insurance and so on, and stimulus payments was because there's a pandemic on. They're in outrage saying people are staying home. Well, that was the point, right? And we wanted them to stay home, number one. But number two, aren't they really saying at this point, we don't want to pay more than $10 an hour, so we want to make the case to the decision makers in this country to dismantle what's left of the meager social safety net so that they have to take whatever we give them.
Absolutely. They fought against the minimum wage laws for that reason. They fought against having to have an unemployment compensation. Let's remember, we only have a federal unemployment compensation because Roosevelt was pressed from below to do that in the 1930s, a time of capitalist collapse. So that's all this is. This is just another ideological, rhetorical BS to try to get them able to have cheap labor. And it'll be used by right-wing and Republican lawmakers to diminish or dismantle the social safety net, the unemployment insurance, and they're doing their task as the supporters of capitalism. Look, the capitalists had a rough year like everybody else. They didn't make the kind of profits in most cases that they're used to. They've had now 12, 15 months of a difficult time. They're raising their prices to recoup some of what they lost, and they're demanding cheaper labor to recoup some of what they lost. You know, in a capitalist system, it is a perfect example of what a friend of mine once called the suck up, kick down bureaucratic arrangement. Capitalism is a system that positions those at the top to be most able to cope with a disaster like the pandemic. And then the further down you go in the economic food chain, the harder it is for people to cope with this. And all we're seeing is the offloading of the costs of this pandemic from those at the top who want to come out as rich as they went in, and they're doing that, and they make the costs of it all be borne by those at the top. And that's what this is all about. The shortage of labor is simply a moment in the effort to get people to work at low wages by an employer class determined to recoup whatever they lost during the pandemic. And if the mass of the working class allows them, they will.
You know, Richard Wolff, I maybe last question, but I see these people on television. Sometimes I used to run into them on the Amtrak or whatever, Union Station, whatever, and they always look so calm. And my final question to you, I guess, is I really wonder how they live with the cognitive. You know, I started out by talking about my own struggle. How do they live with the cognitive dissonance of spouting this stuff and living inside these mental models all day when they are so inherently flawed? I mean, I get that that's why they get so angry when somebody on Twitter points it out to them or whatever. But how do they? I don't know how they do that. I don't know how they function in that cognitive model they've created for themselves. Do you have any thoughts on that? You must run into them.
Yes, I do. But I noticed two groups, RJ. I really do. Yes, the ones you point to, the true believers, if you like, who come up with the rationales for all of this, and the rationale you have to give billions to Pfizer, or else we'll never have another vaccine against a disease. You know, these crazy rationalizations. There's a whole group of, I would call them middle managers and even some top managers who believe it. But I can assure you that there are among those at the top plenty who know very well. Let me quote to you without naming, but you would know him if I named him, a conversation about 10 days ago. Goes like this. How can you honestly tell me, and then I say something that outraged me. And here comes his response. I know that, Rick, because my friends know me as Rick.
Right.
I know that, Rick. Look, we had our good time here in America. I looked at him, I said, what do you mean? He said, we had a great ride here in America from about the middle of the 19th century to the end of the 20th. It was up and away with capitalism. Money could go up, wages could go up. Really, it was a great ride up. And everybody feels good on the ride up. And I know, like you do, Rick, he looks at me, that we're now on the ride down. And on the ride down, there's pain, there's difficulty, and it doesn't feel good. That's where we are. And on the ride down, here's what happens, Rick. Everybody grabs as much as they can before it all disappears. And that's what we're doing. And I don't claim it's good or moral or appropriate, but that it is what it is. And that's what's going on. And if I didn't do it, because this is a person who heads a very large bank in New York City, and if I didn't do it, I'd be out on my rear end and I'd be replaced by somebody who did do it.
Who was it? And I know this is a friend of yours, but who was it that said the innermost circle of hell is reserved for people who knew better and said nothing? I just wonder, maybe your friend would be better served in his own psyche as well as for the world if he just took the money he's got, stepped away, and said, "You know what? This is all nonsense." But of course,
there are people, I know people like that. There are people who were bankers in New York and are now operating a modest bed and breakfast in rural Vermont. And if you talk to them, they will tell you, we are happier now than we've ever been. We enjoy this work. We have a lot of time off. I wouldn't go back to Manhattan and resume my job, even though it makes 10 times the amount of money I'm making here, not for love or money. I am so glad that I got out of that rat race, et cetera, et cetera. There are always people like that who understand. And the irony is, they're the ones, of course, who talk to me.
right.
Because if they were the other sort, they couldn't tolerate me for 5 minutes. This guy is like the others. Talking to me is touching base with a part of himself, and he needs it, and I appreciate it. He could turn the tables on me and say, "Well, what are you talking to me for?" And the answer is, I too want to understand what makes that side of the ledger tick, because I do want to change it all, and I need to understand my adversary, and I want to talk to him. So we have something each of us gains from this odd conversation.
And I guess we're going to have to leave it there, but I was in that world myself at one point. Unfortunately, I didn't make a fortune to while away the rest of my life on. But it took a couple serious depressions before I realized I can't live in it anymore. And for those who do and struggle, if any of you are listening right now to touch base, get the hell out and do something good while you still got enough of your life left ahead of you. So that's my closing thought. Richard Wolff, if you have a closing thought, we'd love to hear it. But
no, it's to go back to how we began. This country has, for the last 70 years, lived in a kind of hysterical fog. We call it the Cold War. We call it many things. It was the effort of the business and conservative community to roll back all of the radical events of the 1930s and the early 40s. They were completely blindsided by the crash of capitalism, which was never supposed to happen and started in October of 1929. And then they were overwhelmed by a government that turned against them, they thought, to help the mass of people who they thought shouldn't get that kind of help. And then they were finally blown away when the United States allied not with Hitler and Mussolini, but instead with Joseph Stalin in a war against Hitler. It was too much. And with the end of the war, World War II, and the death of Roosevelt, they went on a tear to undo, to erase, to exterminate communists, socialists, anarchists, liberals, trade union, everything that smacked of this overwhelming of what they thought the American system was all about. And we lived in that. We lived in a fog of justification of capitalism under all circumstances. It was as dense a fog here as we pretend it was in Stalin's Russia. And to a considerable degree, it probably was. But we have nothing to say. It's like being critical of the Chinese today in terms of what they're doing to their minority Muslim populations, coming from a country that has just waged a 20-year war against Iraq and Afghanistan, killing more Muslims in the process than the Chinese could imagine. I mean, the absurdities of this are the signs of a fog that is now finally lifting, but we kind of have to understand that lifting of a fog takes time, is circuitous, and is going to show up in odd conversations like those I have with my banker friends.
Well, they're lucky to have you to talk to, and so are we. So,
All right.
Richard Wolff, as always, thanks for your insights and thanks for coming on the program.
Thank you, and I look forward to our next continuation.
As do I. And we'll be right back after this. I am Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.